Here we are. This is our first chapter on a real macronutrient. So prepare yourself. We are going to be getting more detailed. Now, I know for me, that's a big smiley face. Kind of a crooked smiley face. Yay! It may not be for you, but in either case, make sure that you are spending enough time. So our first macronutrient is carbohydrates. We've already introduced a little bit about carbs way back at I believe, chapter 1, but this is a whole chapter on carbs. Our next chapter is going to be on fats, then protein, then vitamins and minerals. So we're entering this part of the course where we talk about each nutrient specifically. This is just what I said. As a matter of fact, this chapter has 2 PowerPoints, so make sure that you are spending enough time. There's a lot of information. You don't have to know all of it, as always, but I'm glad you're watching the video because then you'll know what to know. Here's our outline. All right. So we're going to start with the basics. Carbohydrates. Now, specifically, the carbohydrate chemical structure looks like this. I didn't do the subscript below. Specifically, a carbohydrate, if we draw out the molecule, it looks like this. Kind of has a hexagon, like a stop sign shape. You do not have to know all these chemical specifics. I like to give you them just so you have them. I like to show a picture so you know what a carbohydrate looks like chemically, molecularly, but you don't have to know what it looks like specifically. You definitely don't have to know the chemical equations. What I'd like you to know is that carbohydrates are an arrangement of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So just know that each carbohydrate is some sort of arrangement of these 3. We've introduced this. Now we're going to get a little more specific. Absolutely need to know these. We have 2 structural types, the simple carbohydrates and the complex. Simple sugars are either monosaccharides or disaccharides. Here's a monosaccharide, 1 sugar. We know this. Mono means 1. A disaccharide is 2 sugars. Basically, 2 monosaccharides joined together. So complex carbs. Then we have, simple carbs. Then we have complex. Complex carbs are polysaccharides, long chains. Usually it's 10 plus sugars. Okay, here we go. Simple sugars. Monosaccharide has 1 sugar. Disaccharide has 2. I'm going to give you some examples. All right. I'm only going to ask you to know 1 monosaccharide, glucose. Even though it's in red, I'm making the executive decision that right now you don't need to know this. Let's give our simple, good old glucose. This is a monosaccharide, 1 sugar. Folks, this is the glucose that circulates in our bloodstream. Everyone's heard of blood sugar. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. Diabetics have a difficulty in regulating blood sugar. When we talk about blood sugar, what's circulating in the blood, it is glucose, a monosaccharide. Very abundant. This is what our cells will use for energy. Because we already know, well, what's the function of carbohydrates? Energy. I've given you some other examples of in what kind of foods we find fructose or galactose, but you don't need to know those. And if you're wondering, glucose is basically in every disaccharide. So when we start to build these sugars out, glucose is pretty much a part of everything. Okay. Then we have disaccharides. I'm asking you to know 2. Sucrose is a disaccharide, 2 sugars. This is table sugar. If you put sugar in your coffee, what you're adding is a disaccharide called sucrose. And of course, lactose. You may be familiar with lactase, which is the enzyme, or you may have heard of lactose intolerance, right? Some people, their digestive tracts are not able to handle lactose. Lactose is a disaccharide found in dairy. You do not need to know specifically what makes up each of these disaccharides. You can see it's 2 monosaccharides put together, but you don't need to know those. Good. Keep it simple. Simple sugars. Monosaccharide with 1 sugar, glucose. It's our blood sugar, energy. Disaccharides, 2 sugars, sucrose, which is table sugar, and lactose, found in milk. Then we have our complex carbohydrates, or polysaccharides. Many sugars put together. I'd like you to know all 3 of these. These are our 3 examples of polysaccharides: glycogen, starch, and fiber. Glycogen, it looks like this. So unlike just one hexagon, it's many hexagons gone together. Glycogen, it's not found through foods very often. Instead, glycogen is how our body stores sugar. Glycogen is the storage form of sugar. This is really important. Think about it. If you eat a meal, you're going to bring in some glucose, right? Pick a meal, spaghetti dinner. Anything really has some glucose in it, right? Well, when you eat a meal and you have all that glucose, you don't need all that glucose in your bloodstream right away. We don't want to overload our blood with glucose. So what our body does is we ingest that food. It's got a lot of glucose. Our body will purposely keep some of that glucose in the bloodstream. But then a lot of that glucose, it will store for later. And the storage form of glucose is glycogen. The benefit of this is, what if you don't eat for 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours? If you don't eat for a while, it's no worries. Even though you haven't brought in any glucose for your blood right then, your body has some stored glucose available. So if you haven't eaten for a while, your body will go to those glycogen stores and break them back down into glucose. Okay, cool. Starch is found in food. We find it in potatoes, pasta. Sorry, this potato. Okay, it looks weird when I do it that way. Okay. So starch, really long chain of sugars. It's found in it's found in potatoes and grains, pasta. Then we have fiber. Fiber is really unique. Some fiber can be absorbed in our GI tract, but a lot of our fiber, it doesn't provide energy like other sugars. It doesn't provide energy like other polysaccharides. Instead, one of the main functions of fiber is, let me get a different color here. How about blue? One of the main functions of fiber is that it helps to move things through your GI tract. So fiber is a polysaccharide, long chain of sugars. It is not used for energy by our body. Instead, it is not absorbed, it stays in our GI tract, and it helps to move things through our gut. Excuse me. I just yawned. You can't see it, but I just yawned. So the idea for this is that it helps to keep our poops regular. You know, if you have enough appropriate fiber in the diet, it helps to move things through so we don't have GI problems, either diarrhea or constipation. You don't need to know the types in food right now. Don't worry about that. All right. You can read about this. To be honest with you, I'm not that worried about it. I think this is good information to have for reference, but you don't need to know it specifically. Okay? So you can read this, but you don't need to know it. All right, so a review. We have the polysaccharides, many sugars put together. Glycogen is our stored glucose in our body, stored sugar in our body. Starch we get from pasta, grains, potatoes. Fiber. A lot of the function of fiber is that it helps to push things through our GI tract. Okay. Good. All right. So now we've reviewed the structure, let's talk about the function. Well, since we had such a good beginning to the semester, you already know some of this, so it should help you go through this a little easier. We know that carbohydrates, energy. You can see here I said immediate. The idea here is it's what our cells go to first for energy. We know this. What our cells go to first. Certain types of carbohydrates can help move things through our GI tract. Fiber. So here are our two main functions of carbohydrates. Energy, that's what our cells go to first. Energy. And then certain forms of carbohydrates. Certain forms of carbohydrates help to move things through our GI tract, specifically fiber. So when we talk about energy, we can utilize both the simple sugars for energy, and we can also utilize the complex sugars for energy. Together, this is still what our body will turn to first for energy, and then it'll turn to fat next. Remember, ultimately, no matter what our cells are doing, they tend to burn a carb-fat mixture. It's just that if they need the quickest energy, it's easier to burn carbs right away. Whereas as we need energy over a longer term, we're able to burn more fat. But within carbohydrates, the immediate is going to be glucose. It's what our cells go to absolutely first. But we can also break down that glycogen back into glucose. You can see I have a number here. You don't have to know it, but I'm just saying, typically on an everyday basis, about half of our total energy comes from carbohydrates. Okay. We also talked about the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. Remember? AMDRs. Somewhere between, for almost everyone, somewhere between 45 and 65% of our diet should come from carbs. We'll talk about what's the best mixture of simple and complex a little bit later, but we're just going to start off simple. About 45 to 65%, somewhere in there. Of course, it's a range. If I'm an endurance athlete, I'm going to be on the higher end. I need 62% carbs. If I'm pretty sedentary, meaning not active, I'll be on the lower end of that. Okay, that's all we need to know for now. Extra information on the screen. I have a little, again, this will not be on the test, but I have some notes here. At the very beginning of this PowerPoint, there was a slide with the Atkins diet, the Atkins dude, who, by the way, the doctor that invented the Atkins diet, he himself died of cardiovascular disease, which is the same thing that he said his diet would help prevent. So, interesting there. In the last 20, 30 years, carbohydrates have gotten a bad name. Don't eat a lot of carbs. Bad. But the truth is we need carbs. Okay? These are a vital energy source. So we need carbs. It's more about balance. Now that we're starting to get into these recommendations, well, carbohydrates should make up somewhere between 45 and 65% of your diet. Now we can start to talk about getting the right amount of carbs, not too many, but also not too few. And we can start talking about the right types to be ingesting. Okay, so this is going to be the same format that we will follow for every nutrient. We reviewed the structure, talked about the molecular structure, chemical structure, talked about how we classify carbohydrates, simple versus complex. And then we reviewed what are the dietary recommendations. Carbohydrates should make up somewhere between 45 and 65% of your overall diet. Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is digestion and absorption. What is unique about carbohydrate digestion and absorption? Now, of course, we already had a chapter on the GI tract. So this means that when I talk about an organ, you're going to already have some idea of what I'm talking about. Look at that. It's like I meant it to happen this way. Okay, so there's nothing significant about the top here, so don't worry about it. Every nutrient gets mechanically digested in the mouth. Every nutrient is chemically digested in the small intestine, right? Blah, blah, blah. But what I want to introduce are some things that are unique to carbohydrates in terms of digestion and absorption. So one thing I want to point out is we can begin chemical digestion of starch in the mouth. Starch only. So starch is such a complex nutrient that we need to begin to break it down early. Now, no other nutrient can be chemically digested in the mouth. The mouth does mechanical digestion of all the nutrients. Through chewing, it mechanically breaks down the nutrients. But the only nutrient we can begin to chemically digest in the mouth is starch. The enzyme that allows us to do that is called amylase. Amylase is the enzyme that helps to speed up digestion of starch. When you see amylase, it's always paired with starch. Enzymes are specific. Each enzyme can only work on a specific thing. So here we see our first example. Amylase can work only on starch. We do have some salivary amylase. We have some amylase enzyme in our saliva. That's how we can begin to chemically digest starch. Okay. I'm having a beverage here to keep myself awake. I apologize. Here's some other information, but you don't need to know this. A lot of this is a review of the digestive tract that we already talked about. Now, what I want to add. So we already remember the basics, and please forgive me for another bad drawing, right? We have, let's see, eyes, nose, mouth. Okay, here's my dude. He's got some hair. Oh, I don't want to do that. Okay, he's going to bring in food. We already know this. So for all nutrients, carbs, fat, or protein, we bring in food. It goes into the mouth. What is unique about carbohydrates is we can begin chemical digestion of starch in the mouth. That's pretty unique. The food will continue from our mouth down the pharynx into the esophagus, which gets to the stomach. It's a really bad stomach. The food then continues into the small intestine. Now, we may remember, the small intestine is where we complete chemical digestion of the nutrients, and then we do absorption into the bloodstream. So we bring in food through the mouth, we mechanically break it down, we chemically break down starch in the mouth, travels down the pharynx and esophagus to the stomach. Stomach stores the food for a couple hours, more mechanical digestion. Now we bring that food into the small intestine. Now we are able to finish breaking down the carbohydrate, and once it's broken down into its smallest pieces, it is absorbed into the bloodstream. Now, here's the thing. Where does the blood go after the small intestine? The answer is the liver. Liver. So look, and I'm trying to draw this here. Once nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream, where do they go? Liver. So these recently absorbed nutrients go right to the liver. That's their first destination. After nutrients are absorbed through the small intestine wall, pretty much all of them are going to go to the liver. And here's what the liver does. The liver decides what to keep in the bloodstream and what to store. This is exactly the example I was just talking about. You eat a big meal, you don't need all those carbs in your blood right away. So what happens is your liver will keep some of the sugar in the blood, but the rest of the sugar it will store as glycogen. And then later on, if you haven't eaten for a while and now we need more energy, well, now we can convert that glycogen back into glucose to have more blood sugar. Now, of course, all of this was the process for most carbs, with the exception of fiber. Fiber does not go through those. Remember, fiber is not absorbed into the small intestine, into the bloodstream. Fiber will continue into the large intestine to help food stuff pass through the large intestine. This talks about the same stuff. This is just another way of looking at it. Let me use yellow because we have a nice visual here. I'm always a fan of reviewing as much as I can. We bring in the food. The oral cavity does mechanical digestion of all nutrients, but I can begin to chemically digest starch. The food travels through the pharynx, down the esophagus, into the stomach. Then we do more mechanical digestion, and the food travels to the small intestine, where we do absorption. Nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream. Where does that bloodstream go? Liver. And the liver will keep some glucose in the blood, but the rest will be stored as glycogen. All right, I mentioned this already. Now we just want to make sure we have a slide on it. We talked about lactose being a disaccharide. Well, some people don't have the appropriate enzyme for lactose. Make sure you can define lactose intolerance or a lactose deficiency. Usually this has to do with a lack of lactase. So the inability to digest the disaccharide comes from not having enough of the enzyme. Remember, anytime a word ends in ASE, it's an enzyme. Okay? So if you don't have enough enzymes, well, how on earth are you going to break down that lactose? Here are some examples of how you can treat lactose intolerance, but I will not ask you this on a quiz or exam. Okay, here we go. This is, again, going to be the same playbook. We did the intro, structure, function. We talked about the dietary recommendations a little bit. Then we talked about specifics about the carbohydrates in digestion and absorption. Well, now we get to metabolism. So for each nutrient, we'll talk a little bit about how it is metabolized. Okay, well, we first have to define metabolism. The best definition that I like to use is metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body. Sometimes people make the mistake of only thinking about chemical reactions involved in digestion. So a lot of people, when they talk about metabolizing, do you have a fast metabolism, slow metabolism? And what they're really referring to is how quickly you're able to burn down food for energy. And that relates to digesting nutrients. But you see, in reality, metabolism includes all our chemical reactions, not just the chemical reactions involved for digestion. It could be any chemical reaction, laying down new bone, forming other chemicals, any chemical reaction. Usually, we relate this to a rate also. So we could talk about metabolic rate, how quickly some bodies completes these chemical reactions. So for example, people that are said to have a higher metabolism, their chemical reactions happen more quickly. And if I have faster chemical reactions in digestion, I got more enzymes, I can digest more quickly. On the other hand, people that are said to have a lower metabolism have slower chemical reaction rates, which means in terms of digestion, these chemical reactions happen slower. Okay, let's talk specifically about carbohydrates. I've already begun this discussion, so here we are repeating, which isn't a bad thing. The more we can repeat something, the easier it's going to be to sink into our brain. So we already said, from the small intestine, nutrients are transferred into the blood. That nutrient-rich blood, where's the first place it goes? The liver. What does the liver do? It decides what sugar to keep in the bloodstream and what sugar to store as glycogen. Remember, some of that blood glucose stays in the blood. We always need a certain amount of blood glucose, but other excess glucose is stored as glycogen, which means that if we need energy later, we can just break down that glycogen back into glucose. Now we're adding a little more. Where does our body store glycogen? Well, 2/3 of our glycogen is actually stored in our skeletal muscles. I mean, we have over 600 skeletal muscles. We got a lot of skeletal muscles, which means that we can store a lot of glycogen, and we can store a lot of glycogen. And then the remaining 1/3 or so, we store right in the liver. You should know those numbers. Okay. When we talk about metabolism for energy in the cells, before we were taking a more global look. We were saying, well, overall in the body, metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions. That's true. But now, instead of thinking of the body as a whole, I only want to focus on energy metabolism. For cells. Energy. So even though metabolism technically is the sum of all the chemical reactions, well, we can also look more specifically at certain parts of it. So here, I only want to look at the part of metabolism that would be the chemical reactions involved in producing energy at the cells. Energy metabolism for cells is basically how our cells produce energy. So what will our cells go to first for energy? Blood glucose. What will it go to second for energy? The stored glucose right nearby in the skeletal muscles and somewhat from the liver. And then we will start to burn fat. This here is a bit of a misnomer. It's not like we completely empty the shelves of all the glycogen. Our body's able to start burning fat quicker than before we burn all of our glycogen. As a matter of fact, I can't even think of a time when a human being burned all their glycogen. We have so much of it. So while we're still burning some glycogen, our body's already beginning to do the fat metabolism. It just takes a little longer to get to. So this is the order for what our cells turn to for energy. Glucose in the blood, glycogen, stored glucose, and then fat. Speaking of burning fat, and we'll discuss this more in our next week's unit, is burning fat always a good thing? No. We like to burn some fat. I mean, to be honest, we can burn quite a bit of fat. I mean, I don't know what other scientific words to use. We can burn fat in pretty high amounts. As a matter of fact, our body likes to burn fat. But there is a potential of burning too much. One example of this would be a low-carb diet. So when we burn too much, when you burn too much fat, I mean, we can burn a pretty high amount, let's be honest, but when you burn too much fat, we have an accumulation of these byproducts called ketones. Really important. Maybe you've heard of diabetic ketoacidosis. We're talking about those ketones. So again, it's normal to burn pretty high amounts of fat. We like to burn fat. And every time we burn fat, we produce these byproducts, these chemical byproducts called ketones. Well, not a big deal if we're only burning a so-so amount of fat. But what if we don't have enough carbs in our diet? What if someone's on one of those low-carb diets? If you don't have enough carbohydrate, you're going to burn more fat. And there's a potential, when we burn more fat, we accumulate more ketones. And there's a potential for developing too many ketones, or developing ketones more quickly than your body's able to get rid of them. And that can lead to ketoacidosis, when your blood becomes acidic because of a buildup of these acidic chemicals called ketones. Okay. So many topics to talk about, and still I could talk about so much more. I've got to rein it back. We've mentioned blood sugar. We know we have to have blood sugar. Gotta have it. This is the monosaccharide glucose that circulates in our bloodstream, quick energy to cells. As I said, if we eat a big meal, we don't want to keep all of the glucose in our blood. We keep some in our blood, the glucose, and then the rest we store as glycogen, stored sugar, in the liver and the skeletal muscles. Well, how is this process regulated? How do we keep just the right amount of glucose in the blood? It's really important. The bloodstream is like our highway. The bloodstream is how we get things everywhere. So it's really important that we have the right amount of glucose in the blood at all times, so we can properly supply energy to all of our cells, but without accumulating too much sugar, because too much sugar in the blood for a long period of time can break down the blood vessel wall, cause high blood pressure, a whole host of other things. Okay, so the idea is the amount of sugar we have in our blood should equal our cells' need for fuel. If you're sitting on the couch, you don't need as much blood sugar because you don't need as much energy, you're not doing anything. On the other hand, if I'm exercising, my body needs more fuel, so therefore I need to have more blood glucose. Okay, there are two hormones that regulate our blood sugar levels, insulin and glucagon. I'm pretty sure everyone here has heard of insulin before, really important. These hormones are released from the pancreas, you should know that. Insulin and glucagon are released from the pancreas, but they actually go to the liver where they have their action. I apologize, I need a little pick-me-up snack here so I can stay awake. It's not you, everyone, it's me. Didn't sleep well last night. So very important, the hormones are produced and released from the pancreas, yet they travel to the liver. That's where they have their action. Okay. I'm pausing to finish chewing this, otherwise known as a dramatic pause. Okay, so these are both hormones produced and released by the pancreas. After being released, these hormones go to the liver. Insulin is a hormone that's released when blood sugar is too high. Insulin is released when blood sugar is too high. When insulin gets to the liver, because it wants to fix too high a blood sugar, when insulin gets to the liver, it tells the liver to store some of that glucose as glycogen, thereby reducing the blood sugar back to normal. On the other hand, glucagon is released when blood sugar is low, if you haven't eaten for a while. This is the hormone released from the pancreas that goes to the liver, and tells the liver to release glycogen stores. Tells the liver to break down glycogen back into glucose. These are really important regulating hormones. If we're not able to properly release these hormones and have our desired effect, then we may have excess glucose in the bloodstream. Over time, folks, that's really bad. The excess sugar has a really deleterious effect on the blood vessel wall. Or on the other hand, what if we can't supply enough glucagon? So when we need blood sugar, we're not able to break it back down. That is much less of a problem. Typically, the problems are with insulin, even though I'd like you to know both. Okay. Now, don't laugh. I like to use little schematics. Bear with me, because I really think it can be helpful, even though it might look confusing at first. This here is our normal balance of blood glucose. Usually a normal value per a given unit of blood, 60 to 100 milligrams of glucose. So at any given time, per certain area of blood, we want about 60 to 80 milligrams of glucose. Well, what if I just ate? I just ate all these pixie sticks. I just ate all that sugar. If I eat sugar, blood glucose will go up. When blood glucose is too high, the pancreas releases insulin. Insulin then leaves the pancreas, goes to the liver, tells the liver to store excess glucose as glycogen. By storing more glucose as glycogen, it lowers the remaining blood pressure back to normal. On the other hand, what if I haven't eaten for a while? So instead of my glucose norm, my blood glucose is dangerously low. Haven't eaten for a while. Well, then my body's going to be triggered that blood glucose levels are too low. When blood glucose is too low, the pancreas will release glucagon. Glucagon goes out to the liver, breaks down some of that glycogen back into glucose. So our initial problem was not enough blood glucose. Well, now the liver is going to release glycogen back into glucose, thereby releasing blood sugar, increasing blood sugar back to normal. All right. Now, of course, this process, the most common problem is diabetes. I'm not going to try to talk about that so much. Make sure you know the basics. Type 1 diabetes is sometimes called early onset, less common. This is when the body fails to produce insulin. If you cannot produce insulin, remember, insulin is released when blood sugar is high. If you cannot release insulin, blood sugar is going to stay high. And that's why we come up with all those secondary problems. It damages the blood vessel wall. Type 2 is when you may have insulin, but your tissues are simply resistant to it. This is sometimes called adult onset. Here are some specific examples, but you don't need to know this. There are long-term effects of diabetes. Long-term effects can include nerve damage, poor circulation. Here are two examples. Blindness or eye problems. These are all serious complications from a chronic state of too much blood sugar. The increase in diabetes statistics has been crazy, and this ends in 2005. You don't have to know these numbers, but I'm just giving you an idea, and in the last 15 plus years, I'm sure it's gotten much higher. And you can see how the diabetes breaks down along ethnic and age groups. You don't need to know that specifically, but I'm just showing you. You can read about this. You can read about this. None of this specific information will be on the test. Okay. We're almost done with this first video here, and then we'll continue with the second video. So a good question is, how do we know the good versus the bad? We know we need carbohydrates, especially as an athlete. We've got to get energy, right? But there certainly are better choices for carbs and then worse choices for carbs. One way that we can measure this is something called glycemic index. Glycemic index. Glycemic index is a number assigned to a food based on its ability to raise blood sugar. It's a value given to a food on its ability to raise blood sugar. For example, a low glycemic index food, that will cause the blood sugar to rise more slowly. Let me write it in here. So a low glycemic index food, the blood sugar rises slowly. On the other hand, a high glycemic index food causes a rapid increase in blood sugar. It's okay to have some of both of these as an athlete, but it's important to understand them. Here is a picture of the glycemic scale. I'm not going to ask you any specifics, but think about it. Our high glycemic index foods are our packaged foods, cereal, crackers, cookies, packaged foods, and a lot of our white grain products. White bread, white rice. It's okay to have some of both, but we can't have too much of all of one or the other. Particularly, we don't want to have too much of the high glycemic index foods because they'll raise blood sugar so quickly that our body won't be able to keep up with it. Okay, the higher the number, the higher the glycemic index. I'm not going to ask you any specifics. Be able to just give an example. So high glycemic foods tend to be the packaged foods, white grains and breads. The low glycemic index foods tend to be vegetables, fruit, good stuff. I'm not going to ask you the scale. It's just here for your reference. And I will also say, not everyone uses the glycemic index anymore, from my understanding. So some people like it still. Some people don't. They find it a little outdated. But I think the principle is worth thinking about because I think it does matter. Okay. Ideally, you want to have a mix. Most of the time, we want a lower glycemic index food. Most of the time. Of course, we're going to have some of everything. But, if you're having a bowl of pasta, maybe don't have the whole bowl of pasta and just that. Maybe have a half of the bowl of pasta and have some vegetables, which are high glycemic index. The high glycemic index are particularly helpful during athletic activity. Gatorade's pretty high glycemic index. It's meant to be. Sometimes we want that Gatorade to get in our bloodstream quickly to help replenish electrolytes, right? During a football game. During a football game, in the moment, you might want high glycemic index food. So an example of when we would actually want high glycemic index food is during activity, when I need that quick energy, when I really want it to raise the blood sugar quickly. All right, we're going to end there. I'll see you for part 2.